Oh, hey, that worked. So, hey, do you think I can record something on this?
No, not after last time.
Oh, come on, it was just one base raid. It's not like it could happen twice.
No, I don't want to have to move bases again.
It's just one little review, it should be fine. Hello everyone, and welcome to Review Shark. Today, we're going to be talking about Wolfenstein: The New Order, a game where you just murder the living shit out of some Nazis. Just lots of murder. There's more to it than that, naturally, but if you're playing a Wolfenstein game and not expecting to fight Nazis, then welcome to the outside world, underground mole person. Released in 2014 by Machine Games, The New Order was a soft-ish reboot of the franchise after the last attempt back in 2009. A game so mediocre that you can only find it through secondhand copies nowadays. So pretty much everyone knows what Wolfenstein is and has been as a franchise. You kill Nazis. Usually with supernatural elements as the unstoppable slab of meat, PJ Blazkowicz. So after the 2009 softish reboot, which was met with rapturous cries of meh, where do you go from there? Into one of the best franchise reboots ever made. So full disclosure of bias right now, I love this game. This is one of my favorite shooters of all time, and it's a game I always come back to at least once a year. So you're probably asking, what makes this meathead Nazi shooter so special, Review Shark? I fought Nazis thousands of times in video games before. What keeps this game fresh? Well, everything about it really. But let's start with the gameplay. In Wolfenstein: The New Order, you must do the shooty bang bang at bad men until they stop existing. You've got the standard array of bang bang shooters: assault rifle, shotgun, pistol, sniper, melee, and exotic. You also have a tiny laser cutter for a while. You can get an upgrade to make it a decent anti-armor gun, but until then it's just a cutting tool for lock puzzles. Not as effective when unlocking flesh though. On top of that, each weapon has an alternative fire mode that changes how they function. Pistol goes from burst fire to single shot silenced, assault rifle changes to a rocket launcher, shotgun changes a hallway into a blender, and the sniper rifle changes to a laser rifle. It gives your arsenal a good deal of variety aside from what it first appears. Your exotic laser rifle just changes from shoot to cut, but it compensates for that with a ton of upgrades that turn it into a BFG. Its cutting mode lets you go through metal sheets. Good for finding secrets and making holes in cover to shoot through. Cuts up Nazis pretty well too. Weapon switching is quick, so combat is always flowing, and environments are dense enough to accommodate any particular strategy, whether that be long-range application bullet surgery, or close-range brain massage. Weapons can also be dual-wielded for double the effectiveness, but you move much slower as a result. In addition to this, your health regenerates in increments of 20, but you need to pick up health packs to go past that. It's a good way of keeping you in the fight until you have an opening to grab some health, so you never have that "my game just auto-saved while I have 1 health" issue. There's a nice balance between the more classic arcadey type fun and the more cover-based modern shooters, so neither one is a superior option, and with how fights are structured, you're always switching up how you approach them. The visual feedback and sound design is what really makes these weapons great though. They're all exaggerated to a degree that even the default pistol feels strong to fire. Almost all the guns have a lower pitch to them, with some added bass to really help sell the feel. Not to mention the animations themselves, as even BJ seems to struggle against the recoil of some of these guns. The kickback can be a little bit ridiculous, but it gives the weapons a fantastic feeling of power. They're also all made to take up a good chunk of the screen, so you aren't missing out on any of it. All of this gives the combat a great frenetic energy, as you're chewing through ammo and Nazis in equal numbers. Even they have some great reactions to the combat as well. Nazis will stumble, grab hurt limbs, slide between cover, or panic as they realize you just shot a live grenade out of their hand. Not even just that, the Nazis in this game are just full of goo and bits. It's channeling the brutalism of old school shooters in a way that just becomes a ridiculous spectacle to watch. You've also got a number of perks you can earn through actions you perform in-game. The first ones are just basic functions, like the ability to throw back enemy grenades, and require almost no effort to get, while later ones can help spice up the gameplay a little bit. It's also not just generic, incredibly minor percentage increase, it's a flat bonus to things like magazine capacity, movement speed, reload speed, loot found, to the more fun things like getting armor from quick kills, getting health from stealth kills, grenades detonating on impact, or making Nazis explode even harder. It's the perfect blend of all these ingredients to produce one really great feeling shooter. Powerful sounding guns that back it up with proper damage and feedback, combined with fluid movement and actually decent balance between its various approaches. The game's level design is generally pretty great as well, with lots of little hidey spots to find some extra ammo, health, armor, or collectibles for the more completionist crowd. Although the levels tend to be pretty linear between the various set pieces, they still give you enough room to poke around and explore some different paths, which gives you plenty of ways to traverse the environment and ambush your foes. It seems like each time I return to this game I find some new spot or route I didn't even notice before. There's a pretty decent variety of enemies as well to complement the level design. Shooty boys, commandy boys, armor puppies, bigger shooty boys in rocket or shotgun flavors, biggest shooty boys, robotic mosquitoes, tin cans, and robo puppies. Battles will almost always feature a good mixture of these enemies that best keep you on your toes. It might not sound like an amazing variety, but the AI is what really makes these guys formidable. Nazis will flesh you out, flank you, purposely not shoot if you're distracted on the bigger enemies so they can sneak up on you. And you can bet your ass that if they get a good angle, they won't unload that entire clip on you as fast as they can. Despite this, they're still humans, mostly, and you're the original avatar of angry, so they'll still be dropping like flies. But they do manage to present a decent challenge. You have to actually put some amount of thought into combat, lest even your angry not be enough to save you from death. They're also unlike Nazis in most other games in that they actually... let's talk about the music. The soundtrack for this game is masterfully done, especially with its theming. It was composed by Mick Gordon, who also did the soundtrack for Doom 2016. Seems like the guy really knows how to sell brutal violence. As much as I love that game's soundtrack though, I think I honestly prefer the New Order's. The soundtrack does a much better job of selling the story beats, as well as perfectly capturing the mood of each scene, rather than just being constantly... a bit overwhelming, radical though it may be. The music that plays throughout the game for the Nazis is always harsh, with electronically made sounds to emphasize their dehumanized nature. The Resistance, however? The songs focused around them are always played with real instruments. The sounds of folksy guitars with their occasional screech of the wire contrast with intense, overpowering, and almost headache-inducing synth of the Nazis. You can still hear those real instruments poking through the Nazi-focused music though, which is a nice touch. Like the theme of the... concentration camp.
Look at all that smoke coming from those chimneys. What are they burning in there? What do you think? Well, I don't know. I mean...
Which starts off as another Nazi theme of oppression. Before slowly shifting towards a melancholic, folksy tune as you get to the prisoners of the camp and see these innocent people just struggling to get by. But you can always hear that electronica in the background to remind you who's in control. It's a great mixture of music that almost always perfectly complements the mood. My personal favorite is the title screen music, since it immediately gets you in the mood for Nazi murder. The environments throughout this game also follow the same contrast that the music presents. That being, environments that the Nazis control tend to be colder, muddled colors to emphasize their iron-fisted control. Architecture is sterile and samey. Environments for the Resistance, or just places free from Nazi control however, tend more towards warmer colors, the lingering, comforting remains of humanity that the Nazis seek to extinguish. This game has beautiful environments, and you can tell that there is some real love behind them. Compare the introduction shot of the Allied fleet heroically flying in, to that of the same shot after the flak starts to rip them to pieces. Another of my favorites is the London Nautica, a top Nazi research facility with a museum section towering over Big Ben in the distance. It's such a perfect visual metaphor of the Nazis' oppression of everything that isn't German. Also, there's the fact that the material the Nazis use for all their buildings is literally crumbling and rotting around them. Subtle. Despite how outlandish they can get, they always manage to feel immersive from the dedication to detail. Even smaller details like what the canned foods would look like is thought out. Skyboxes are also just utterly beautiful. They're stylized in just such a way that keeps them looking great, even as technology marches on. The design of the Nazis in their gear is extremely dieselpunk, and also extremely German. Everything is designed more for efficiency than aesthetic. All the posters are in German, all the advertising you see is 60s designs with a distinctly German flair. Everyone is speaking German. German, German, German. There's almost nothing remaining of all the cultures, which... How about the story? Following the events of the previous game, sort of,
Don't remember much.
the Nazis have given up on the supernatural and decided, fuck it, let's do science. And science they did. Now the entire world is rapidly losing the war, forcing the various allied countries to make one last-ditch effort to stop Death's Head, the mastermind behind these advances, before the Nazis can take over. Remember, science is always better than magic. You could research spellcasting for years to master throwing a single fireball around, or you could just buy a gun. It casts death at 500 rounds a minute. The New Order has probably my favorite introduction in all games I've played, just about. You open with the brief flash of Get Psyched, followed by a pretty good sum up of Blazkowicz's character.
In my dream, I smell a barbecue. I hear children. A dog. And I see someone. I think I see someone. These things. None of it for me. I'm moved by roaring engines. I'm lone warriors. We come from the night.
We'll come back to that. Then you fade into a beautiful shot of the Allied forces moving in for the mission, with hopeful music just playing softly in the background. And for a moment, you think this will be like any other Wolfenstein game. You go in, you murder the Nazis like a big hero, and win. Right? But then you remember, oh right, the title of the game. Then you turn your head and shit immediately starts to go down. Flak goes flying, planes go down, one of the fuel lines bursts, you have to drop your cargo before the ship goes down, a great brief introduction to the new Nazi threat as their highly advanced fighters begin to gun down your allies. It's utterly chaotic and a perfect introduction to the game's general tone. Your plane goes down, you swap to another, you crash, and then you see the real desperate situation the allies are in, as robot dogs stalk the field with giant Tesla-spewing robots. Blazkowicz naturally has no problem dealing with them, but your allies are going down quickly around you. We get some character focus on two of the members of your squad, Wing Commander Fergus and Private Wyatt. Fergus is brash and destructive, Wyatt is naive but resourceful. From there it's a fairly standard tutorial. You learn about the various game mechanics in a relatively safe and structured environment, with enemies that aren't as much of a challenge as they'll be later on. And then you fall right into the incineration chamber. Yep. After a brief struggle and fight with a Nazi experiment, you're captured by the mastermind himself, Death's Head. Somehow I always knew this was the path Lieutenant Barkley was going to go down. Death's Head in the previous games was always focused on science, and disbelieved anything supernatural, but was also kind of generic personality-wise. He created some awful things, but was always hindered by the Nazis insisting on supernatural pursuits. But now they've thrown their whole weight behind him, and he's become much more unhinged as a result. He's a ruthless mad scientist who no longer sees anyone who isn't German as human. He's commenting on you and your companions as if you were just toys with parts that he wanted, and even taunts you with the choice of which of your companions he should dissect. And should you decide to refuse, yeah, Death's Head isn't fucking around. He forces BJ to watch the whole procedure as you hear your sacrificed companions screaming in pain in the background, followed by Death's Head happily walking away and switching on the incinerator. You and your surviving companion break the pipes and escape just as the room explodes, and shrapnel was lodged directly into BJ's brain, putting him in a catatonic state as his limp body floats on a piece of wreckage past the title. Welcome to the New Order. Pretty long prologue, honestly, but it never feels like it's dragging on. It's a great introduction to the mechanics, and sets the mood perfectly. The game from here is the journey through the new Nazi-controlled world, as you gather up whatever allies you can and try to stop Death's Head once more. If I'm being totally honest, the story itself isn't really the most interesting aspect of the game. It's a pretty basic revenge plot of stopping Death's Head. You raid a few places, you gather strength, inevitably the villains retaliate, and then you fight the final boss. The New Order's main strength isn't with that story though, it's with the characters that are driving it. The cast is a decent size and each character has a great deal of personality, even those with less screen time than others. They're all just desperately struggling against a seemingly unstoppable foe, and you can tell their spirits are pretty much crushed when you first encounter them. You have Wyatt or Fergus, the companion you save during the prologue, both of whom give you alternate ways to traverse levels, and an upgrade as well that matches their characters, as well as another side character unique to them to help flesh out the crew. Wyatt gives you the ability to lockpick and upgrade armor pickups, alluding to his more quiet and quick-thinking nature. He brings a companion called Jay to the group, who is definitely not a famous guitarist whose name also starts with J. Fergus gives you the ability to hack and upgrade your health, giving more to his brash and forward nature. He also brings Tekla, a woman obsessed with predicting the universe. Both of them are great choices, but don't affect the story as much as they could, unfortunately. They both get a different initial escape from the prison, but cutscenes with them play out pretty much the same, just taking each other's place. Bit disappointing, but they're still great characters who I think make 2 super playthroughs worth it despite that. Fergus is constantly swearing.
Fucking Christ almighty!
Wyatt is just the goodest boy.
For your collection, Jay.
Fergus is sarcastic and done with all the bullshit in the world.
Nothing much of interest ever happens around these parts. Today I landed a helicopter on a nicked Nazi nuclear submarine aircraft carrier, after which I donned a deep-water diving suit, swam down an abyssal trench in the middle of the Atlantic fucking ocean. Don't mean to bore you with the details.
Wyatt is a good-natured dork.
You know, I dabbled in music a little bit while I was at Harvard. Yep, played clarinet in the marching band.
But both are equally tired and lamenting the choice that they were the one to live instead of the other. Seeing another person dissected in front of you will do that. And that's just the 2 standout examples. The rest of the cast is a bit too long to list, but they are all equally entertaining. It also makes me wish the game was longer, so I could spend more time with them and see more interactions between them. And then you have our main protagonist, B.J. Blazkowicz. Where once he was a silent slab of meat, Blazkowicz has gotten a much more interesting take on his character this time around. Heck, I'll go out on a limb and say that Blazkowicz is probably the most interesting FPS protagonist of all time. The New Order is part of what I lovingly refer to as the 90s shooter revival, where we see a ton of classic FPS franchises getting rebooted for the modern age. Doom Guy went from a meme to an even bigger, angrier meme. Lo Wang went from being an old pervert, and also kind of racist, to an egotistical dork trying to be a badass. And Blazkowicz went from nothing to tired. Blazkowicz is very, very tired. He's beaten the Nazis time and time again, only for them to come back with some new insane plot. It's clearly taken a toll on his sanity. Throughout the game, he's musing on the inherent violence of his actions, or of the horrors of war, lamenting events in his past or of things he couldn't prevent. And sometimes he'll just play pretend with a car. The beginning speech I mentioned earlier? It really is a perfect sum up of his character. He's essentially trapped in this never-ending fight against the Nazis, unable to reach a peaceful life free of them as he truly desires. It's an amazing example of using the meta of a never-ending franchise to define a character's experience and worldview, without it being some stupid wink-wink moment. There's an examination of toxic masculinity going on with this character as well, especially when compared to the Nazis' rigid ideals of how a man should be. Outwardly, he's basically the Nazis' ideal man. Proud, dominant, strong, not letting your emotions get in the way. His appearance is even complimented on as being very Aryan. Externally, he's a pinpoint match, but internally he differs from that key ideal in some ways. Emotionally, he's not locked away. Blazkowicz genuinely cares, and this is reinforced repeatedly from his actions. There's a sincerity to all of them, and even if he's not always the best at expressing it to others verbally, he's very much capable of demonstrating it. He accidentally freaks out Max with a saw, and at first seems a bit cold towards his reaction. But then he goes out of his way to find Max's lost toys and to set them up in a little display. A woman in the forced labor camp is weeping over her sick husband, and Blazkowicz can find medicine for him in the guard building he infiltrates. A woman from the camp loses her ring, the last thing she had left of her husband, and Blazkowicz finds it for her. He'll play guitar with Jay despite just threatening him over being called a Nazi. He'll hear out Tekla in the middle of the night, then show her how to use a gun when she asks for help. There's a line shortly after he escapes with Anya from the asylum about him being unable to grieve.
And they grieve for their dead. Such raw sorrow. Can't partake. Mom would flood oceans. Would drown me. If I let it out.
He's been through so much throughout all these games.
Troop transport. More dead kids. Seen this too many times.
And now he's been forced into a Nazi-controlled future, and he doesn't really know how to process it, other than the obvious. He'll try to put up a front that he's having fun with his rampages, but his killing of Nazis isn't framed internally as him trying to be the biggest badass. It's more of an emotional release, a way of venting the immense frustration he has towards the pain and suffering that Nazis are inflicting on others.
Nazis. Shooting folks who can't defend themselves.
He's utterly merciless in his Nazi murder, even gleefully saying how he's been stabbing, shooting, and strangling Nazis. But the only times he shows any joy in his work is when he's around others and putting up a front. The rest of the time, he's as dead serious as can be. He's a man who only really knows how to fight, and this is pointed out repeatedly by others. He's a thoughtful person at times, but it's also exceedingly made clear by the game that he's really kind of extremely impulsive. Blazkowicz has a habit of not thinking through his actions before going through with them, just kind of hoping that it'll work out. Like for instance, going to a forced labor camp with absolutely no plan and immediately getting put in a death march towards the gas chambers. Or cutting the wires to an elevator which ends up getting him trapped and leading him to death's head. Or the most egregious example, grabbing a sparking battery and just kind of hoping it'll work out. He might be thoughtful and poetic, but that doesn't necessarily equate to smart, and Blazkowicz is kind of aware of this. There's one major thing that saves him throughout all of this though. Sheer determination. Blazkowicz will come back no matter what happens to him, which is a good way of integrating the regenerating health mechanic into Blazkowicz's character, rather than it just being a convenience. Blazkowicz gets stabbed and reduced to near death, gets that health back and comes out stabbing. Gets a rock dropped on his head? Completely okay in the next scene. Gets electrocuted from grabbing a sparking battery? You fool. This is but a scratch to Blazkowicz. But even if he's determined, he's still human. Only so much of his health will come back at a time, which helps reinforce part of his fragility as a character, that being his age and slow tiring out. This ties into my favorite level in the game, the Berlin Catacombs, where Blazkowicz delves through the waterlogged underbelly of Berlin. There's no combat until the last section of the level, and is mostly just spent doing some light puzzle solving. But what really sells it is just Blazkowicz's dialogue to himself all throughout. This level more than any other gives us an understanding of just how barely held together Blazkowicz is, as he recalls all these miserable things throughout his youth. Swimming in the red tide,
Felt like my skin was on fire,
retrieving a pocket watch from a cold, dark well,
but it wasn't as deep as this.
swimming in the caverns underneath Death's Head's X-Labs,
It wasn't as dirty as this.
but how none of them compare to how isolated and tired he feels now. A man who's fought Nazis his entire life in a future controlled entirely by them. A man unable to mourn the immeasurable loss of life from the Nazis' cleansing and how he couldn't prevent any of it. A person who cares in a future that doesn't. But he'll just keep going. There are Nazis out there oppressing people and he's going to stop them, even if he has to take on the whole world by himself.
It comes down to it. I'll fight alone.
Which brings us to that thing he hates most. The Nazis. And here's what I have to say about the Nazis. They are bad. Tune in next time when I attempt to stall to the next scene by improving and doing a really bad job of it.
Phew.
What?
Well, it's just that I was worried for a minute there.
About what?
He almost got political. It's just a video game after all. They're apolitical by nature.
But they're Nazis. Isn't that kind of a political thing?
No. Look at all the other games that have had Nazis in them. They never got political. Besides, everyone calls everyone Nazis nowadays. What does it even—
Guess what, buckos? We're getting political in this bitch! Games in general, especially first-person shooters, have always had a problem. You need to quickly and effectively establish who the bad people are that you're shooting at, and remove any thought the players may have into why they're shooting them. You don't want the players to feel bad or conflicted about the things they're shooting. Games are fun, you know? You don't want to be thinking about these enemies. This bleeds into some of the most popular types of enemies in games. Zombies, demons, aliens, people that aren't white. You know, things you don't question shooting. So when you need to establish a shootable enemy, you use quickly recognizable imagery that just screams evil. And what happens to be one of the most notorious evil groups in modern history? You get Nazis. Nazi zombies. Space Nazis. Supernatural Nazis. Nazis, Nazis, Nazis. Even if they're not being directly depicted, Nazi imagery is still a popular go-to for evil/fascist enemy. You know about Nazis, they were in your history books doing bad things. I think they did a Holocaust or something? But don't mention that because we don't want the player to feel bad. General Deathshead is saying he wants to put a Nazi flag above the White House. Ooh, how evil. Better go shoot those evil Nazis. Because games are typically not very critical or examinatory of the enemies in front of the barrel of your gun, they just rely on quick shorthand. We know Nazis are bad. We don't have to explain why, they just are. What inspired this section was a video that Lindsay Ellis did about Mel Brooks and satirizing of Nazis. Oh wait, hang on, let me just... Perfect. Anyway, there's a section in the video about Nazi portrayal throughout film history, and film has had much longer to evolve as an art form than video games have, which led me to look at Nazi portrayal in video games. The New Order has been one of my favorite games since I first played it because of this particular point. Especially since these days, where apparently saying Nazis are bad isn't enough anymore. The New Order goes into very much detail about why the Nazis are bad. Past games just use them as the enemy because that's what they were known as. Evil. They did the bad thing in World War II, and so now we can just hate on them without thinking about it. They were cartoonish, and we as a culture just sort of took that for granted. Their portrayals became so separated from what they actually were that Nazis are evil was really all just about they ever were known for. Along with being fascist without ever explaining what that means, did the Holocaust, and hates Jewish people. Things that are now apparently being denied or questioned because life is hell and everything sucks. Wolfenstein obviously isn't the only one who ever did this. Portrayal of Nazis in video games for the longest time has been more akin to, say, the Nazis in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they were basically just bad guys in Nazi cosplay for all intents and purposes. The New Order, however, does not take that for granted. The base assumption one takes from it, and from its history, is just that. You kill Nazis because they're evil. However, the New Order goes into much more detail than that. These aren't cartoons, these are Nazis. Okay, I mean, they're still cartoonish. The real Nazis didn't have giant robot dogs. But this is an important tool of the New Order. Exaggeration. One of the best ways to give something its due representation is to show it as it truly wishes to be. The New Order takes Nazi rhetoric and imagery and pushes it to its extreme, to display just how truly absurd and inhuman it is. The Nazis want racial and societal purity, and boy howdy are they gonna get it. This also sort of leads into a small tangent, which is why I think the sequel got labeled as SJW propaganda. The second game goes out of its way to compare the Nazi movement to, similar mindsets in America right now. The only real criticism of those ideas in New Order is Jay's line about America being like the Nazis, in regards to systemic treatment of minorities, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, before this game's alternate history kicked in. Also, just like, all of American history, really? But I mean, who would ever think America is as bad as the Nazis? It's such a silly notion. Moving on. You find articles of Nazi propaganda that are constantly propping themselves up and displaying everyone else as subhumans. They'll even casually mention this in dialogue between one another. You'll hear about how they're stomping out all other cultures and replacing it with their own superior German culture. Though try as it might to appear perfect, the cracks are always on full display. For instance, despite appearing to have conquered the world, they still haven't conquered all of Africa, which has been managing to just barely hold them back. There's also a level where you're crawling through the underground of Berlin and you hear citizens commenting on life, and how could these awful terrorists want to ruin it? The Nazis did so much to make sure this place is as peaceful as possible. Then you immediately walk through a cave containing some of the older generation super soldiers. A city literally built atop Death's Head's cruel experiments. Fucking perfect. The newspaper clippings and letters you find throughout the game add to this, detailing how the Nazi machine thinks, acts, and showing it from other angles as well. At one point in the game you go to the moon, and even there you find an article on how they're planning on trading out the remote mining that their drones do with forced labor camps, so they can send degenerate filth away from the good and pure Germans. Even something as great as colonizing the moon is twisted with how it could be used to punish others. You read articles about how British citizens are now accepting sauerkraut rather than fish and chips as their national dish, and finally accepting the Nazis. After going past the British ghetto towards a monument to the Nazis' utter vanity and callousness, while the person in the car with you explains how they just leveled whole blocks to build it. The New Order doesn't sugarcoat Nazi atrocities either. One level begins with you being sent to a forced labor camp, literally marching in a line towards gas chambers to be killed. Blazkowicz only gets by because of his stature and strength, meaning he'd be a good worker, and then is immediately tattooed as if he were just property. The Nazis will do anything to reach their own vision of purity. Diversity means nothing to them.
Klaus knew, of course, what that meant. He begs the doctors not to report it to the authorities.
Their culture is superior to all others, so why should other cultures even exist?
They would throw me in the gas chamber just like they did all the others.
No thinking either. In Berlin, you hear a speech about how you should be good and just and pure of thought. A true German is always loyal. You wouldn't want to be impure, would you? You wouldn't want to cause trouble by daring to question the glorious leader, would you? Death's Head is even the perfect embodiment of this. You find out after the time skip that he's the head of advanced research, and a very influential figure in the Reich. He'll give big speeches about how powerful and good the Reich is, and how glorious these achievements are, all after having seen him dissect your companion in front of you and creating awful weapons of war. Near the end of the game, he lets this guy down entirely and starts speaking of all others as just subhuman filth. He calls them parasites. He says their inferiority is biological. He'll even chastise Blazkowicz for blowing up a Zeppelin full of hard-working men, because truly no other people matter to him other than his own. Frau Engel, the secondary antagonist, is a great example of the other end, how women are viewed in this society. She speaks of how women shouldn't be a part of the army, and how she's only allowed to do so since she's done her part for Germania and raised 6 Aryan children. A space marine writes an advertisement for himself about how he wants a wife, and how his wife might want to be free from the pressures of life, and should just want to stay home and raise children. Women must be obedient baby-making machines. Only the man is allowed to be the leader, and to make decisions. If you aren't a straight white male, then you won't succeed in this society. And even then, only if you're a pure Aryan German. It gives the Nazi machine more depth as well, to horrifying effect. Dehumanize others to the point where they're not even people anymore. Yeah, they've got a lot of advanced technology, but most of it is just dedicated towards the slaughter of their enemies. And numerous times it shows that stepping out of line or failing to be a good German results in not good things. You'll hear some citizens wondering what happened to their neighbors after the secret police visited, and they seemingly just vanished overnight. Before deciding it's not worth it to question things. You find a letter from a woman who laments how she can't just be with her lover, another woman, and marries a man just as a cover. She's then captured and sent to a concentration camp, with the Nazis citing paragraph 175. If you're not familiar with it, it was part of the German criminal code at the time that criminalized homosexuality. To be fair, the Nazis didn't create this code, but they did broaden the hell out of it when they took power, in order to send a lot of LGBT people to concentration camps. It's a code that I'm sure didn't last long after the war ended in 1994! This dehumanizing nature is on full display throughout the game. The imposing and impressive architecture, the cries to be a good, pure German, and literally walking through a concentration camp. Nazis are bad. Not bad for badness' sake, but because of how their ideology devalues others. How it demonizes anyone who is different. How it destroys any sense of individuality. How it refuses to learn from other cultures and instead crushes them outright. Nazis may have been enemies in games for years before this, but for most part they were just bad guys in Nazi cosplay. These are Nazis. They don't speak English because the game designers didn't want to hire people who could speak German. They don't want to just plant a Nazi flag over the White House. They don't have some generic evil plot. They want to exterminate anything they deem to be lesser. They want to exterminate every culture that isn't German. And that is why Nazis are bad. The New Order is a masterpiece in my opinion. It's both a ridiculous over-the-top Nazi-killing shooting spree with some of the most satisfying combat in any shooter I've played, and a melodramatic examination of characters living underneath the Nazi rulership for most of their lives, and of how a person who has fought Nazis as long as Blazkowicz have might cope with that. It has fantastic art design and direction, it has actual commentary on its villains, wonderful writing with actual depth, fantastic music, and all of this packaged into one of the best shooters of the past 2 decades. It's an over-the-top love letter to shooters past. It's a ridiculous gore fest of Nazi murder. It's a great adventure with strong characters. It's a lampooning of Nazi ideology and iconography. And it's just goddamn fun. Wolfenstein: The New Order gets... You know what? No score. Maybe I don't need to slap a quantifiable number and everything just to be a reviewer. Unless I think it's funny. I'll just recommend playing it instead. At the end of the day, it's still a meathead shooter, but damned if it ain't one of my favorites. Tune in next time where I learn what brevity is the soul of wit means.
Have you finished complaining?
Oh, hey guys. Want to see my review? Okay, look. I know I messed up last time, but I took precautions this time so the signal can't be traced. So don't worry. Oh. Whoops. Nope. Get the fuck out of here. We're not talking about you.
Well, it's not my fault you don't understand irony.
Ow!
Fine. Jeez. So much for the tolerant left.
Fucking irony poisoning.